Hello everyone. I'm going to begin today's webinar on grant writing. My name is Christina Chin and I'm a Program Officer at the National Center for Education Research, and I'm here with my colleague Katie Taylor from the National Center for Special Education Research. Thank you for joining us. This is going to be a pretty intensive workshop with a lot of information being shared, so be sure to note any questions you have along the way. Okay? So the purpose of this grant writing workshop is to provide you with some information and advice on how you can write a successful and competitive application on our main research grants program at IES. In particular, we're going to be focusing on two grants programs: the Education Research Grants Program. The CFDA number is 84.305A, and the Special Education Research Grants Program. The CFD number for that is 84.324A. We understand that grant writing is a process that starts with an idea and progresses through several stages. As you start writing your proposal, you may also be contacting people to line up your research team. Grant writing tends to be an iterative process since the majority of grants do not receive funding the first time around, and that's okay. Our goal with this webinar is for you to try to write the most competitive application you can so that you may be one of the lucky ones to receive funding the first time around. Or if you don't get funded the first time around, you'll learn some new information about ways in which you can improve your application. So to begin, I wanted to provide an overview of IES, particularly for folks who may not be as familiar with IES or are first-time applicants. So IES is the independent research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. We are nonpartisan by law, so we are not involved in the policy-making process. We are charged with providing rigorous and relevant research to ground education practice and policy. We also are charged with sharing this information broadly. So we want to disseminate what works, but we also want to understand what doesn't work and why, so that we can help to improve education outcomes for all students, in particular for students who are at risk of failure. Within IES, there are 4 centers. First is the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance, also known as NCEE. And under NCEE, you will find the What Works Clearinghouse and the Regional Educational Labs. And you'll also find the large-scale evaluations that have been mandated by Congress. Then there is the National Center for Education Statistics, also known as NCES. Within NCES, you may be familiar with the NAEP assessment, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Under NCES, you'll also find many large national longitudinal data sets, including the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study and the Educational Longitudinal Study, just to name a couple of examples. Next, we have highlighted in blue the Education Research Centers. In these 2 centers is where you'll find the discretionary research grants programs. It's important to note that under the IES structure, we have a standards review office that handles the oversight, review, and processing of grant applications. They, as you can see in this diagram here, are separate from the research centers. Because they are separate, program officers within NCER and NCSER can provide a lot of technical assistance as you prepare your grant applications. So the objectives of the IES grants programs are to improve education outcomes for all students, particularly for those who are at risk of failure. The grants program do this by developing or identifying education interventions that enhance academic achievement and can be widely deployed. By identifying what works and what doesn't work, and they're encouraging further research and innovation, and by understanding the processes that underlie the effectiveness of education interventions and the variation in those effectiveness. For more information about the funding opportunities available within NCER and NCSER, you can find them on our website. Here's a screenshot of the funding opportunities page. So just to recap, this webinar is going to be focusing on the main research grants program, the Education Research Grants Program and the Special Education Research Grants Program. These two grants programs are pretty similar in that they are organized by research topic and research goal, and we will talk more about these topics and goals later on in the webinar. So I'm going to now talk about some good general tips in terms of grant writing. So what I typically tell applicants is to think about their proposal as a persuasive essay, because you really want to sell your research idea. You want to be able to show that you are the best person to do the research proposed, and you want to be able to build goodwill and trust with the reviewers. So how do you go about doing that? We think you should do that by demonstrating that you know what the problem is and that you have the best way to address it. So in the opening paragraphs of your project narrative, you should set the scene for the readers and reviewers by identifying what you're doing is important and how you're going to go about doing it. You should organize the information in a very accessible way. You don't want to lose readers right off because they don't understand what you're doing. So the opening paragraph is critical in terms of hooking the reviewers and leading them to believe what you're doing is important. So to that end, your statement of purpose should be part of the opening paragraph. Your statement of purpose should be short and attention-grabbing, and we recommend that you have your friends, family, and other researchers take a look at your opening statement and provide feedback. Okay. Similarly, we see the theory of change as crucial to a successful application. We will talk in more detail about what goes into a theory of change later, but I'm going to provide a brief overview here. The theory of change is the model underlying your research, and it serves as a roadmap for how you will be describing the work that you'll be doing in your project. It can be constantly evolving in that depending upon the findings from your study, your theory of change may actually change. So it may not be a static model, which is fine. We know researchers in other fields use terms like logic models or logical framework, and we see those as pretty similar in terms of what we're referring here as theory of change. So these terms may be used interchangeably. Your theory of change should also be reflected in your research plan, such that you need to specify exactly what it is you're looking to explore, develop, validate, or test. In terms of the outcomes of the study, you also want to be able to specify what it is you're measuring and who you're targeting. For instance, what measures will you include for those in the treatment versus control conditions? Finally, you should also share your framework and statement of purpose with your program officer. IES program officers are here to help you answer questions and provide feedback on your proposal. We also can't reiterate enough the importance of having a very clear and succinct application. You want to make sure in the significance section that you're not too general in your description. You want to be able to provide sufficient detail regarding the intervention or the program or policy that you're studying. If you're looking to develop an intervention, it is important to specify how you're going to be developing, revising, and testing the components of the intervention. You want to clearly specify your data analysis plan as well. You don't want to just have a statement saying you're going to be conducting HLM analysis and leave it at that. We want you to provide detail about how you're going to be analyzing the data and include formulas as appropriate. Similarly, try to refrain from using a lot of jargon. Our review panels are pretty diverse in their areas of expertise, so don't take for granted that they know what you're talking about. So provide some context and background. And also, make sure you're using correct grammar and that everything's spelt correctly. All of that goes a long way because reviewers get frustrated when they can't understand what you're saying because your sentence doesn't make sense. So give the reviewers a break and make sure your writing is as clear as possible. We also have on our website several resources for researchers that you may find helpful, including other webinars. So next I'm going to go into some general requirements that we have in the RFA for the two primary education research grants programs. So under the Education Research and Special Education Research Grants Program, you must measure student education outcomes in your study. The project must also be relevant to education in the United States, and it must be conducted in authentic education settings. If you have questions about what we mean by an authentic education setting, we have it well defined in the RFA. If after reading that you still aren't sure, please contact your program officer and they would be happy to provide more detail. As mentioned previously, all proposals must also specify one research topic and one research goal. In terms of student outcomes, the ones we are most interested in vary by the grant program. Here's a table that outlines the specific student outcomes that are of interest for the Education Research Grants Program. As you can see, the outcomes are broken out by grade level. So if you're proposing a project that's targeting pre-kindergarten students, then your outcomes should focus on school readiness, including pre-reading, language vocabulary, early STEM, or social behavioral competencies. If you're targeting students in grades K to 12, the outcomes that you may look at include learning, achievement, higher order thinking, reading, writing, STEM education, progression through the education system, social skills and attitudes, and behavior supports for learning in school. If you're looking to address post-secondary students, the outcome there should focus on access to, persistence, or progression through and completion of post-secondary education. If you're looking to focus on developmental education programs at the post-secondary level, additional outcomes may include achievement specifically in reading and writing, English language proficiency, and STEM. For adult education populations, the focus there should be on student achievement in reading, writing, and STEM. You can also address outcomes related to access, persistence, and progression through completion of adult education programs. This table highlights the special education outcomes of interest by age and grade level. For birth through age 5, so infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, we're looking at developmental outcomes and school readiness. That includes developmental outcomes across a number of areas, including socio-emotional, communicative, cognitive, language, and physical development. And for the remaining ages, kindergarten through high school, we are interested in achievement in the core academic content areas, behaviors that support learning in an academic context, and functional outcomes that improve educational results and transitions to employment, independent living, or post-secondary education. Those last areas are mainly for those in secondary school transitioning to independent living or employment. And I just want to note that you can look at outcomes after they finish high school, but the actual intervention must be something that occurs earlier in secondary school. So when preparing a grant application, the first and most important thing to do is read the RFA. Even if you are resubmitting an application and you're pretty familiar with the requirements of the Education Research and Special Education Research Grants Program, there are some changes, and we just want to make sure that you are aware of those changes. In addition, we think it's important for your co-PI, statistician, methodologist, or developers, really pretty much anyone else who's participating in the preparation of your application or who are involved in the project to read the RFA. In addition, the Sponsored Projects Officer should also read the RFA, since for most institutions and organizations, they are the ones who will be submitting the application for you. On to the discussion of research topics. As a reminder, you have to specify a topic and a goal if you are submitting to the Education Research or a Special Education Research Grants Program. So every application must identify a research topic area. You will indicate your topic area on the SF 424 form under item 4B. You also want to make sure that it's identified at the top of your abstract and at the top of your project narrative as well. Listed here are our current research topics under the Education Research and Special Education Research Grants Program. Just to reiterate and emphasize again, under each of the topic areas, you must address a student education outcome. Please note that the grade range that you focus on may vary by topic, so make sure you're addressing the appropriate grade range for the topic you are applying under. We understand that sometimes your project may fit under more than one topic area, so we have some advice about how you can decide between overlapping topic areas. Under 305A, the Education Research Grants Program, we have a table here that outlines the grade range by topics. So if you're looking to focus on students at the pre-kindergarten level, there are 3 topics that would be relevant. They include the early learning programs and policies, cognition and student learning, and education technology. Pretty much the remainder of the topic areas focus specifically on students in grades K to 12. Only under the post-secondary and adult education topic will you be able to study sub-baccalaureate or baccalaureate students. Similarly, under the Special Education Research Grants Program, the only topic area in which you can focus on infants, toddlers, and preschoolers is in early intervention and early learning in special education. All the other topic areas must address students in K to 12. Okay, so choosing among overlapping topics. So what do you do when your project can actually fit under 2, 3, or 4 different topic areas? What we suggest is you look at the literature that you're citing in your proposal. For example, is it citing more research in the technology area than in the reading domain? If so, you may want to apply under the education technology topic. You also want to think about the topic in which your area of expertise is best aligned. So for instance, if your area of expertise is more in education technology as opposed to curriculum development, that may be something to consider. Also, think about the specific population of students or teachers that you're targeting. For instance, if your intervention or research is highlighting English learners, think about whether English learners are the main focus of your research or if they're just one of the subgroups of students that you're targeting. If you continue to have questions about which topic you should apply to, please contact a program officer. Now we're going to go on to the goals. As with the topic, you also need to specify a goal. The specific goal of your application should be identified with the SF424 form under item 4B. And you also want to specify that on your abstract and research narrative as well. So which topic and goal best fits your project? This is actually a common question we get, and IES program officers can help you through this process if you have any questions or concerns about which combination is the best option. Now, I'm going to go over some detail about the specific goals. Under both NCER and NCSER, there are 5 goals. Exploration is goal 1, goal 2 is development and innovation, goal 3 is efficacy and replication, goal 4 is effectiveness, and goal 5 is measurement. Here is a general table that provides a breakdown of the maximum budget and maximum years that can be requested for each goal. In terms of the goal requirements, please carefully review the requirements and recommendations outlined in the RFA. In the RFA, we spell out the specific requirements, which is the bare minimum that you should include in your grant application in order to be considered responsive and sent forward for review. However, the RFA also outlines some strong recommendations that we suggest you include or address so that you have a stronger, more competitive application. So if you're looking to do a Goal 1 exploration project, one of the key features is an explanation of the malleable factors that you will be focusing on. These malleable factors must be under the control or can be changed by the education system. Some examples of malleable factors include students' behaviors and skills. You can be looking at malleable factors such as teacher practices or teacher credentials. You could look at school size, climate, or organization. You can also examine specific education interventions, which could include curricula, instructional approaches, programs, or policies. Under Goal 1, you can propose to do secondary data analysis, conduct a meta-analysis, collect primary data, or any combination of these approaches. Under Goal 2, Development and Innovation, the focus is on the iterative development process. To that end, you really want to highlight the features of the intervention that you'll be developing and revising. You want to identify a well-specified theory of change. You want to provide sufficient information about the data that you'll be collecting regarding usability and feasibility. You also want to be measuring fidelity of implementation, and you also want to include a pilot study in which you would be measuring student outcomes to see how promising the newly developed or revised intervention is in terms of helping to improve student learning. Now, there are 4 different types of studies under the Efficacy and Replication Goal. The first type of study is an efficacy study to evaluate whether or not a fully developed intervention is efficacious under limited or ideal conditions. Second, a replication study to generate additional evidence for an efficacious intervention by directly replicating that intervention or varying the original conditions. Third, an efficacy study to follow up or gather follow-up data and examine the longer-term impacts of an efficacious intervention. And fourth, a retrospective study to analyze retrospective or historical secondary data to test the efficacy of an intervention that was implemented in the past. So for folks who are looking to do efficacy and replication projects under Goal 3, the purpose of these projects is to assess the impact of an intervention, program, or policy on student learning. Goal 3 projects are typically implemented under ideal conditions, but you may also want to ask what might be needed to implement the intervention in the future under routine practice. You should also consider the role of the developer. If the developer is going to be involved in the efficacy study, you should have something in place to safeguard against potential conflicts of interest. Also, we do not require confirmatory mediator or moderator analyses as part of a Goal 3 study, but it is recommended that you do so as part of your exploratory analyses. Under Goal 4 effectiveness projects, we expect the researchers to implement the intervention under routine conditions. This is one of the main differences between a Goal 3 efficacy study. Under Goal 3 efficacy, you can implement under ideal conditions, but under Goal 4 effectiveness, you must implement under routine conditions. In addition, a difference between Goal 3 and Goal 4 is that the evaluators are independent from the development or distribution of the intervention. Also, under Goal 4 effectiveness, you must have a strong evidence from a prior efficacy study in order to apply. That efficacy study does not have to be funded by IES, but we do want you to cite evidence from a previous rigorous evaluation showing that the program had an impact so that it warrants further evaluation under a Goal 4 effectiveness study. We don't expect a single Goal 4 effectiveness study to demonstrate generalizability. We expect multiple effectiveness studies to address generalizability. Please note that the sample size for a Goal 4 study is not a key distinction from a Goal 3 study. Goal 4 studies could have the same number of students, teachers, or schools as a Goal 3 study. It's the independent evaluation and the implementation of the intervention under routine practice that is the main difference. So under Goal 4, we also do not require confirmatory mediator or moderator analyses, but we do encourage exploratory analyses of those relations. Also, please note that for Goal 4, the cost of implementing the intervention is limited to just 25% of the budget. So for Goal 5 measurement projects, the assessment is the primary product. You may develop assessments under other goals, but it is not the main focus of the study. For instance, you may be developing a measure as part of a Goal 2 project, but in that case, the assessment would not be the primary focus of the study. Under Goal 5, the assessment development and validation is the primary focus. You would include an assessment framework in your description, and you must link the assessment to student education outcomes. If you have questions about which goal you should apply under, we recommend that you take a look at the RFA, and in particular, look at the section where we discuss expected results. This information may help you identify where your research may best fit. Now I'm going to turn to my colleague Katie Tater, who will lead the remainder of the webinar.
Hi everyone, this is Katie Taylor from the National Center for Special Education Research, and I am now going to talk about the 4 sections of the project narrative. And the project narrative is a big portion of your actual proposal. So as I mentioned, there are 4 required sections of the narrative: the significance section, research plan, personnel, and resources. And each of these sections will be scored by reviewers in addition to an overall score. Okay, so the requirements vary by topic and goals, so be sure to read the requirements very carefully in the request for applications. And again, we specify requirements as well as recommendations in the RFAs. So the requirements are the minimum necessary for an application to be sent forward for scientific peer review. However, we strongly encourage you to follow the recommendations as well, as these will make your proposal stronger and more competitive. And also keep in mind that all of the critical content should be in your narrative, but you can support it with additional information in the appendices. The significance section describes your overall project. So it should describe your research question or questions to be answered and the intervention or assessment that you plan to develop and or evaluate if that's applicable. So you need to provide a compelling rationale for the project, which includes a theoretical justification or your theory of change. And I'll talk about the theory of change a little bit more in a few minutes. And then you'll also need to include an empirical justification. So this should include a description of the evidence that supports your theory of change. And then lastly, you should include a practical justification. So why should we care about your project? What are the real-world implications? And why would the expected results matter in education practice or policy? So when you're writing the significance section, don't assume that the reviewers know the significance of your work. So some of the reviewers might not be in your field, so you need to convince them why your particular question is important. And don't quote parts of the RFA pertaining to general importance. If, however, your project is addressing a consideration or a research gap that's identified in the RFA, you can emphasize this in your application. So under each of the topics, we list considerations or research gaps for that particular topic. And these can include important considerations for the topic, as well as things that may need additional research. So these are things you should consider, but you don't get extra priority points if your application addresses them. Okay, so I want to discuss 2 key pitfalls when it comes to writing the significance section. And the first is related to a lack of clarity in your description of the malleable factors if you're proposing an exploration project, or a lack of clarity in terms of your description of the intervention if you're proposing a development or evaluation grant. So it may be that it isn't clear which malleable factors you're proposing to study or how they're actually under the control of the education system, or it may not be clear exactly what your intervention is. Or it could just be that your description is a little bit confusing. So sometimes we see that it's unclear how the intervention will be implemented with fidelity. For example, it's unclear whether the implementers will actually have the time and resources to be able to implement with fidelity. And then it could also be that from your description, it's not clear that the intervention will have a strong enough impact. For example, maybe it's just too short to expect an impact, or if you're doing an efficacy study, maybe there's not enough pilot data to support the intervention's promise for improving student outcomes. And lastly, a clear description of an intervention should include details about how it will be implemented in addition to what the actual content of the intervention is. So you can describe its implementation in terms of duration and implementers, etc. But if we don't know what content is really being taught or what's going to happen, then the significance of its development or evaluation will not be clear to the reviewers. And so if these things aren't clear, then reviewers may have trouble following the rest of your proposal. So it's really important to clearly describe your malleable factors and/or your intervention. So the second pitfall is related to the theory of change. So if you're applying for a Goal 1 exploration project and you don't indicate why a malleable factor is expected to be related to student outcomes, then that could be problematic. So we need to know the theory behind why you think that factor is related to an outcome. Then if you're applying for a Goal 2, 3, or 4, we need to know why the proposed intervention should improve outcomes versus current practice. And then if you're applying for a Goal 5 measurement project, you need to clearly specify how an assessment will measure a specific factor or outcome and how you will link this to student outcomes. So I do want to stress that all of these elements of the theory of change that I'm talking about now should be described in your narrative, but a graphic can be helpful as well. So in your theory of change, you should also make it clear what you expect to happen in what order and why something is expected to be related to a student outcome. So this could all be represented in a visual graphic, but discussing why it should improve outcomes relative to current practice would be something that you should describe in more detail in the narrative. So your theory of change should describe how an intervention addresses the need that you are targeting and why it should work. So this would be included in the narrative. So consider what the intervention target, either the student or the teacher, should know or be able to do and how this addresses the need that you specify. It should also describe the instructional techniques or practices and why they are appropriate, as well as a description of how the intervention will be delivered. It's also important to be clear about which aspects are different from the counterfactual and what the intervention's core ingredients are. In other words, which specific aspects of your intervention do you expect will drive the changes in student outcomes? So here we have an example of a simple theory of change graphic. This is very neat and clean, and it goes through the process of what is expected to change what and why. So in a simple theory of change, you should include the target population, the main components of the intervention, the underlying processes targeted by the intervention that may explain any changes in your proximal and distal outcomes of interest, and then also your outcomes of interest. So this is just an example. You could elaborate on this depending on your intervention and your research questions. For example, you may want to include moderators in your theory of change as well. So what you should not do in your theory of change is overwhelm the reader with a massive amount of graphics or a very confusing graphic or a lot of text. So we also suggest that you do not use color as a key variable in your graphic because a lot of reviewers will review proposals in black and white. So this is an example of what not to do. This would overwhelm a reader, and it's just too confusing. It hurts to look at. No one would actually want to read, let alone understand this. So this is an example of what you shouldn't do when it comes to your theory of change graphic. Okay, so moving on to the next section, the research plan. In the research plan, you will describe the actual work that you intend to do. So you should be very specific here about your research questions. And depending on your research goal, you'd want to describe how you intend to examine relations between malleable factors and student outcomes, develop and pilot test an intervention, evaluate the efficacy or effectiveness of an intervention, or develop and/or validate an assessment. And it's important to ensure that the application flows across all sections of the narrative. So your research plan should be aligned to your significance section. And it helps to have a step-by-step process so that it's really clear to the reviewers what you plan on doing. For example, if you're proposing to develop an intervention, the process for iteratively developing it and refining each aspect of it, including collecting and using feedback data, should be really clear. And a timeline is strongly recommended. In fact, if you don't include a detailed timeline in your application and your application is being considered for funding, your program officer will be likely to ask you for a timeline. So it's important to go ahead and include this in the application for the reviewers as well. So in the research plan, you should also provide a description of the setting where you'll be doing the research. For example, the size and characteristics of the intervention setting, classroom, school, and/or surrounding community, as well as the population that you're addressing and your sample. So in describing your sample, you should define your sample and discuss the sampling procedures, including justification for any exclusion or inclusion criteria. You should specify the sample size and demonstrate that it will provide enough power to address each of your research questions. And then you should also address attrition, including how likely it will be and any strategies that you intend to use to prevent it over the course of the study. And then lastly, you should discuss generalizability, including how the setting that you're working in will affect the generalizability of your findings and the extent to which your sample and sampling procedures will allow you to draw inferences for the population you're addressing. And then if you're using secondary data, for instance in a Goal 1 exploration project, you should describe the setting, population, and sample for the data sets that you plan to use. Another thing that you need to describe in your research plan is your outcome measures. And these should include both proximal and distal outcome measures. It should include outcome measures that are sensitive to the changes in performance that the intervention is intended to bring about, as well as measures that are not strictly aligned with the intervention and could therefore capture changes in the control or comparison group. So your measures should be aligned with your theory of change. For interventions that are designed to directly change the teaching and learning environment, and in doing so indirectly affect student outcomes, you should include measures of student education outcomes as well as measures of the intermediate outcomes, like teacher behaviors that are hypothesized to be directly linked to the intervention. And you should also include measures that are of practical interest to students, parents, and educators, such as grades, attendance, tardiness, dropout rates, disciplinary actions, or graduation rates. And it's important to justify the use of every measure and only include measures that are linked to your research questions. So if you have measures that are not actually linked to your research questions, this will likely be questioned by the reviewers. And in your description of your measures, you should also discuss the psychometric properties of each measure, including the reliability and validity. And then finally, consider the issue of multiple comparisons when you're deciding which measures to use and how many. So as I mentioned, you should specify the purpose of all your measures. And this includes non-outcome or process measures as well. So for instance, for a Goal 2 development project, you should specify which measures you will use to inform the iterative development process. So these could be things like qualitative data from focus groups or rating scales on the usability of an intervention by the end user. They could also be preliminary outcomes, but you'll have to explain how that measure will then feed back into the iterative process of development. So if you are proposing a Goal 2, 3, or 4, you'll also need to include measures to assess the fidelity of implementation. And also note that if the intervention includes training of the intervention's end user, you should also identify measures to assess the fidelity of the training. So for these measures, you should describe how they'll capture the core components of the intervention and will allow you to determine whether the intervention is operating as you intended. So you should also identify measures of comparison group practices so that you can compare the treatment and comparison groups to make sure that the comparison group doesn't receive key elements of the intervention and that the two groups are getting substantially different services. So you'll want to measure practices that could be happening in either group, but that you hope or assume are only present in the intervention group. And then depending on the research goal you propose, you may also need to include measures of feasibility. So this is any type of feedback provided by the users of the intervention, such as teachers, about whether the intervention is feasible to use and whether it can be implemented within the requirements and constraints of an authentic education setting. And you could use a variety of measures to assess feasibility. The Institute encourages you to integrate qualitative and quantitative methods throughout the entire research process, from planning and inquiry to instrumentation design, data collection and analysis, and dissemination. And the use of qualitative measures is particularly common for the purpose of iteratively developing an intervention or an assessment. So for any qualitative data collection, you should describe the items to be used, the validity, and the procedures for collecting and coding, and for monitoring and maintaining inter-rater reliability. And these are similar to what you would do for quantitative data as well. And you should also discuss how the qualitative measures will be used in the analysis, and if applicable, the mechanism for quantifying the data. For a measurement project specifically, you'll need to provide additional detail depending on the type of measurement project you propose. If you propose to develop alternate forms of a measure, you should describe horizontal equating or the procedures for establishing the equivalency of the forms. And if the proposed assessment is used to measure growth, you should also describe vertical equating or the procedures for establishing a developmental scale. If you're developing or refining an assessment, you should also discuss your plans for establishing the fairness of the test for all members of the intended population. And then also remember that all measurement projects must link the assessment to student education outcomes. So your analysis will depend on your design. But in general, you should describe all planned analyses and describe how these analyses will address each of your research questions. And for qualitative data, you also need to be sure to discuss how you will analyze it. For example, coding for common themes, and then also how the qualitative data analysis will address your research questions. Then for your analysis of quantitative data, you should present your model for each analysis. You should also discuss how you plan to address any clustering or nesting and how you'll account for missing data. So for evaluation projects, you should also discuss a plan for checking for baseline equivalence on your outcomes of interest across the treatment and comparison groups, as well as overall and differential attrition. And then you should also propose to conduct sensitivity tests to assess the influence of key procedural or analytic decisions on the results. So the third section of the project narrative is the personnel section. And the purpose of this section is to describe the relevant expertise of your research team, the responsibilities of each team member, and each team member's time commitments. So you need to describe each member of your team and specifically name each person involved. And you'll want to include personnel at both the primary and any sub-award institutions, as well as any consultants. So you'll want to demonstrate that your team has the appropriate qualifications to carry out every aspect of the proposed work. So this includes the appropriate methodological and content-related expertise, as well as project management skills, and experience disseminating to a variety of audiences. And it's also advisable to make the CVs for the research team specific to the project rather than submitting generic CVs. And this is just a reminder that we recommend that you use Science CV to create the IES biosketches. So here are just some things to consider or strategies for writing the personnel section. So if you, the PI, are a seasoned researcher, it'll be important to highlight that you have enough time to devote to the project. For instance, reviewers are not going to want to see a PI who has only 2% time on a project. So it's also important to adequately describe your credentials because some of the reviewers may not do research in your area and may not be aware of the extent of your experience. And then if you, the PI, are a junior or early career researcher, you'll need to show that you have adequate expertise to do the work and to manage the project. So if relevant, you could show how this work is a continuation of the work that you did in graduate school or during a postdoctoral fellowship. This will help establish your expertise in this area. And then also you'll want to talk about any experiences that you've had that show that you have the appropriate project management skills. Then you should also highlight your publication record as evidence that you have the appropriate expertise in the particular content area. And generally, it's advisable to have a senior researcher on your team. So reviewers are typically more comfortable if you have a senior person to turn to for advice as either a co-PI or a co-investigator, even as a consultant or an advisory board of senior researchers. And you want to just make sure that you include enough of their time on the grant that it's taken seriously. So again, if you have someone for 2% time and that's the person whom you're going to for advice, it doesn't really look like you're going to get their active engagement in the project. Okay, so on to the final section of the project narrative, the resources section. And the purpose of this section is to describe how you have the institutional capacity to complete a project of this size and complexity, as well as your access to the resources at the primary and subaward institutions that you need to successfully complete the project. So in this section, you should also describe your plan for acquiring any resources that are not currently accessible, will require significant expenditures, and or are necessary for the successful completion of the project. So these could include things like equipment, test materials, curriculum, or training materials. So we also recommend that you describe any resources that you have that will help you carry out your plan to disseminate the results of the project. So more specifically, you should note any specific team members, offices, or organizations that you expect will take part in your dissemination plans, as well as their specific role in the dissemination. And then your actual dissemination plan should be described in Appendix A of your application. So this plan should be tailored to the audiences that may benefit from the findings, and they should also reflect the unique purpose of your particular research goal. So in your dissemination plan, you should identify the audiences that you expect will be most likely to benefit from your research and discuss the different ways in which you intend to reach those audiences. Your plan should also reflect your project's research goal, as I mentioned. So for instance, findings from an exploration project are likely to be most useful in pointing out areas for further attention rather than providing proof or strong evidence for taking specific actions. Okay, and in the resources section, you also want to be sure to describe your access to the institutions who will participate in the project and the authentic education settings in which the research will take place. Then in Appendix E, you can include letters of agreement from each of the institutions involved, or from states or school districts. And you'll want to be sure to show that each of these partners understand their role. So the letters should be specific and show that your partners know what they would be asked to do and how much time is involved. And then if you plan to use data from another source, whether it's school records or an existing data set, you want to show that you have access to this data. So in terms of the budget and the budget narrative or budget justification, you want to make sure that these are clear for the overall project as well as for each sub-award. So first and foremost, you should make sure that you don't propose an amount that's over the maximum for your specified research goal. And your budget should reflect both the research goal as well as the scope of the work that you propose to do. So in your budget justification, you should provide a justification for equipment purchases, supplies, travel, and other related project costs for each project year. And you want to be sure to include details about the assumptions that you use to estimate certain costs. For example, for travel, you can talk about how you came up with the total, so including the costs for the airfare, lodging, per diem, etc. And then you also just want to ensure that everything is aligned. So you want to make sure that your project narrative is aligned with your budget and that your budget justification matches your actual budget. This table shows the required and optional appendices and what information must or should be included in each. These are described in more detail in the RFAs, but I'll discuss them briefly. As I mentioned previously, Appendix A is required for all applications and should describe your plans to disseminate the findings from the project. Appendix B is only required for resubmissions, so this is where you would include your response to the previous reviewer's comments. And you should also include Appendix B if your application is one that you consider to be new but that is similar to a previous application. Appendix C is optional, and you can use it to include figures, charts, and tables that supplement the project narrative, as well as examples of measures to be used in the project. Appendix D is also optional and can be used for examples of materials to be used in the intervention or assessment that you're focused on. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you can use Appendix E to provide letters of agreement from school partners and/or data sources, depending on what's applicable for your particular project. And then if you have consultants on your project, you would also include letters of agreement from each consultant in Appendix E. And then Appendix F is required for Goal 3 and 4 proposals, and this should include your data management plan. So this plan should describe the process for making the final research data from the proposed project accessible to others. And the RFA describes the specific information that you should include in your data management plan, as well as resources that may be helpful in developing that plan. So all important dates and deadlines are included in the RFAs. And we encourage you to submit a letter of intent if you're interested in applying. And these are optional, so if you don't submit a letter, you can still submit an application. But if you choose not to submit a letter, we'd still encourage you to at least email the relevant program officer with a brief description of your research and let them know that you intend to apply. And then as for the application deadlines, be sure to submit early. And I don't mean earlier in the day that it's due. I mean like days earlier, because it has to go through multiple layers. So it has to go through grants.gov and get confirmed there, and then go through the Department of Education. And if there's a technical problem along the way, you'll need enough time to find the problem and then resubmit it. And so you just want to make sure that you get confirmation that your application was received at each step. And again, if it's 1 second too late, then it won't be sent forward for review. Then another thing to note is that you should talk to your sponsored research office ahead of time and tell them to expect your proposal so that they can make time for it. And be sure to work closely with them and make sure you see the final versions of all the documents to be submitted. For example, you want to make sure that any last-minute adjustments to the budget don't put you over the budget maximum. Okay, so you'll need two things to actually apply. First, you need the RFA, which contains information for writing your project narrative as well as other content in the application and information related to submitting. But you also need the application package. So in addition to the Adobe Form application package, grants.gov is offering a new option called Workspace for application completion and submission. And Workspace allows a team of registered grants.gov applicants to use a shared online space to complete and submit an application. And here's just a screenshot of grants.gov where you can access this workspace. So now I want to provide a quick rundown of the peer review process. So applications that are submitted on time through grants.gov are reviewed for compliance and responsiveness to the RFA. So compliance focuses on adherence to the application rules. So for example, completion of all parts of the application and inclusion of the required appendices. And then responsiveness involves determining whether you adhere to the requirements of the competition. So whether you adhere to those requirements or the components that are the minimum necessary to be sent forward for peer review. Then if your application is found to be both responsive and compliant, then it will be assigned to a peer review panel. And 2 to 3 peer reviewers will conduct a primary review of your application and provide feedback. And then once the primary review of each application has occurred, the most competitive applications are then forwarded for review by the full panel of reviewers. And then during the panel review, applications are discussed and then rated by all reviewers on the panel. And from that point, we make funding decisions and then contact all applicants, giving them statements from the reviewers so that those who did not receive funding can potentially resubmit in subsequent years. So the Standards and Review Office oversees the peer review process, and it is separate from the research centers. So that's the reason that the program officers are able to talk to you about your proposal in advance, because we're not actually involved in the review process. So if you want to learn more about the peer review process, you can follow this link to find out more information. So in terms of notification about your application, all notifications will come through the applicant notification system, which is the system that you're prompted to sign up for once you've submitted an application. So if you've submitted before, you should already have an account. And so this will provide you with information about the status of the award, and then when summary statements of reviewer comments are released, it will also allow you to access those as well. And then if you're not granted an award the first or second time or third time, we'd encourage you to review your summary statement and talk to the relevant program officer to get insight into what you can do differently and ways that you can think about the reviewer comments to help you improve your application. And another thing we encourage you to do is go to our website and look at the resources for researchers. So this page provides links to different trainings and other information and content that could help improve the quality of your application, such as information about methodology or other things of that nature. And then in addition, there are a number of webinars that you could benefit from, and you can find these webinars by going to the Funding Opportunities page, and then there will be a link to the different webinars. So just some reminders, make sure that you attend to the limits for budgets and duration. Make sure you attend to the required content and appendices, as well as the recommendations to improve your application. And this is just reiterating things that we have been saying all along, but make sure to read the RFA very carefully. And don't be afraid to contact the program officers to discuss your ideas and make sure that it fits with the topic and goal that you intend to submit to. And time permitting, program officers can actually review proposals and provide feedback in advance because we are separate from the review process. But it's important to allow enough time for this. So some program officers may have a cutoff date for when they'll accept proposals to review. So we encourage you to be in communication with the relevant program officer about this. And here's a link to the funding opportunities page where you can access the RFAs and also our email addresses. And thank you all for participating today.